Welcome to another podcast of ARCA's Elevated Views. Today we're going to be sitting down with Tim Padfield, Senior Estimator with Padfield Mechanical in Medicine Hat, to talk about trade scope and all of the different connotations with the different trades working in one project and how we could work together. So let's get on with talking to Tim. Maybe Tim, can you give us a brief background on your involvement in the construction industry?
I started off in the construction industry at a fairly young age. I'm second generation, so I worked at a young age helping my father with commercial plumbing and heating, service work type of thing. Worked through high school, summer breaks. I went off to university and I did my mechanical engineering degree and spent a few years aeronautical industry. Worked at a company called Bristol Aerospace in Winnipeg, then actually moved up to Leduc and worked for Spar Aerospace once they had done it for the C-130 Hercules. Once we decided to start a family, I kind of didn't want to move around the Canadian aerospace industry, which seems to be a prerequisite. So I started with my father's company, Padcar Mechanical. Started off doing just basic design work and morphed into estimating and owning the company, and I spent the last 25 years or so in the mechanical contracting industry. Been active in a number of the construction industry boards, starting at the Medicine Hat Construction Association level, and I've been president of that association, and then got heavily involved in the Mechanical Contractors Association of Alberta, MCA Canada, so I was president of the Mechanical Contractors Association as well. So done a lot of stuff over the years, and I enjoy the industry.
Worn a lot of hats, and it must be interesting as well too, because you say second generation construction, but then I would say, unlike a lot of people that go into it, you also had that formal education, taking your mechanical engineering degree, so you kind of got to see both sides.
We did, and it definitely allowed us as a company to offer different services and a different aspect to some clients as well that worked well with the ability to take their vision, I guess, work in the early stages of a project with the mechanical design. So I've worked a lot with architects and structural engineers and electrical engineers as well. So pretty versed in that side of things when it comes to how our industry all comes together.
And probably that gave you a better understanding of trade contracting into contracts and specifications that some others may not have as well.
Correct, yeah. That certainly is an aspect that worked well in our favor and helped us understand when we were doing bid spec work, the importance of those documents and the contractual side of things.
So one thing I know we wanted to talk about today was trade scope, because one of the big things that we notice in the roofing industry, and I think like you did, you have in the mechanical industry as well too, is it's not always well defined exactly what you're responsible for, what your plan is to do. I know contractors try to define their scope quite clearly when they submit their prices, but then there's always that question on certain trade scope items, what's included, what's not, and then the owner's expectations of, well, I thought that was included, well, I thought this was included.
Yeah.
So how have you found that over the years? Has that progressed to a state, I know, that it's getting a little clearer, or do you think it's still as murky as it once was?
Unfortunately, I am old enough to have been involved in our industry when we were still bidding under Alberta Construction Tendering System, formerly known as ACS, where we had very specific defined trade scopes. And in many respects, that system, it attempted to define where you were and what you had in it. When something was tendered under that system, we didn't have to, on our proposal, specifically say this is included or this isn't included. Again, you're very correct. There was definitely some gray areas and some gaps, but it was actually a pleasure to have a formal system like that to be able to tender from and not have to stipulate everything in your quote. Often nowadays, I've joked to general contractors and stuff. I said, it's always important to say what I have in there, but I think it's more important to read my exclusions than it is the other way. Obviously, we have mechanical, which was on the prints and the specifications, but when we say we don't have something included, it often gets overlooked. And I've found it does create quite a potential conflict, obviously, especially when pricing is coming in at the last minute for contractors, or even in our case as prime mechanical with sub-subs, you may have 5 prices coming in at 5 minutes too, and you are trying to read each quote and define, do they have this or do they not have that, in a very tight time frame, whereas true trade definitions and scope definition definitely attempts to fix that, in that if we know that it's being tendered to a specific way, it's not that important that I have to read all of that.
So with that kind of history that you have with the ACT system, and then moving away from that, how did you find, from an owner's point of view, the pricing went? Do you think there was more contingency or more uncertainty in the prices that would have affected the project price?
I think you would found a greater emphasis on change orders for people that had things excluded. I think in general there was more gaps. Obviously that got missed. Even on the design side, we found that things that used to be on the mechanical prints or on the drawings no longer there. There's many examples that we can talk about. I'm sure we will get into a few, but I'm not going to say that the pricing went up or down according to that. I mean, I think obviously everybody is going to price in the items that they have to price in. And I don't truly believe the owner understands everybody's trade scope 100%. It's not their business per se. If you're building a building for a car dealership, that owner understands his cars and understands that side of things, but he's not going to know all the intricacies of the construction side. So he relies on a prime consultant to give him that knowledge. And even at that respect, a prime consultant relies on sub-sub consultants, and everybody's got to do their job, but there's always those little things that fall between, and trade scopes have always had that, and I think to this day they still exist, those gaps.
So moving away from ACTS, then there was that little kind of in-between time, and now the Alberta Construction Association has formalized those trade definitions that every trade is working with. Have you found that that has improved the definition of scopes?
It's funny you say that, because I believe it's improved some of those. Part of the problem is I think still the age-old ones that are inherently embedded in there exist. And technology hasn't made it actually easier for us. So when we talk about boilers and air handling units and things back in the day, and the way the trade definitions are still written, variable frequency drives, for example, for the motor controls of those units are not the responsibility of the mechanical trade. If it has a variable frequency drive, it's supposed to come from the electrical side, same as like a motor starter, unless it's embedded into the equipment, which sometimes it is, sometimes it's shipped loose. So again, for 25 years, I have not seen that properly defined or fixed. And I don't know if there is an easy way to do that, because every manufacturer is different, and so too are some of the trade scopes that rely on that information.
And all the designers are different too, what they're going to be designing, and they're always trying to come up with the most efficient and the best design, so that continually evolves.
It does, and sometimes we get some projects where cost savings come into play, and then things get cut. They might be VFD ready, and the terminology is not the same. So if it was intended to have a VFD, for example, or be supplied by a particular trade, there's changes that happen that we're not always aware of. And roofing is a perfect example. A lot of times that happens after the tender, the type of material, items like that on the mechanical world, what's going on behind the scenes, so flashings and things like that all change, but we're not really in the loop until you go to put your equipment up. And
it's kind of a segue, but it's a different area, but it's interesting to talk about, because the word value engineering, we kind of joke about it sometimes. It's neither value nor engineering. And that's one thing that we believe is an oversight in a lot of the designs, because as you say, you don't know what's going on in the different trades, and the two trades that we're involved in, mechanical and roofing, are very interconnected, but then during that value engineering stage, they're not discussed in tandem. So if a roof gets value engineered, maybe for a lesser insulation or a type of insulation, or even the color of the membrane, so we don't retain that heat, that would drastically affect the mechanical system, and sometimes that's not correlated when they're talking about it.
100%. Yeah, we've seen that a lot in some of the projects over the years where what was to be an exterior EFIS system to deal with thermal bridging got changed. And from a mechanical designer perspective, it's critical. Even changing window U values, the reflectiveness, roof colors, roof thickness of insulation, even orientations of buildings have changed after mechanical design's been done, and that impacts, again, certain designs. So the ability to relay that is all about communication, and I think in the terms of trade scope, I think that's also a key one, because it's intended to provide a level of instructions as you shall do this and you shall do that. But when value engineering comes into play, I think that's another one that some of those things go off track on you. And one of the other answers out there, there's new contractual methods being investigated, not necessarily new, but in the last 20 years, things like IPD, the Integrated Project Delivery, where the whole team is involved in it. And I think that has the ability to solve some of those issues when it's not always only profit-based or there's a true team environment. And I think the communication is probably better. And quite frankly, when a person is expected to tender a job right down to the last item, if there is a gap and somebody's looking to put that gap onto somebody and it becomes a cost factor, obviously that's where being able to say, no, that's not typically my scope or that's not my thing, is a key item.
It's a very interesting development with IPD. So even for some people who aren't familiar with it, the way I explained it is, imagine instead of all the different trades in their own silos building a project, you're in one giant room. So that I can say from one side of the room, hey, Tim, we're increasing the R value of this roof. Can you accommodate it for in your system? And while we're having that discussion, the electrical contractor may say, oh, you know, that's going to affect my draw on somebody, and the cladding installer may have something else. So we're all talking about the same thing. Has the introduction of IPD benefited trade scope, do you think? Because I'm sure you've been involved in many IPD projects.
Yeah, I believe it's benefited the trade scope, and probably, in my opinion, the biggest way, in that it's not just the trades themselves that are involved in it, it's the design teams, the architects, they're all in that room together. So the communication is real time, and it takes away that traditional animosity between some of those groups and the ability to have to hide behind certain specifications and those types of things. Hide behind is probably the right term, but you're trying to define everything as best you can in written terms. Whereas an IPD project, you have that ability to, for example, scissor lifts or combined use of specific tools on site. In trade scopes and definitions, it says that you shall supply your own scaffolding to an area or man lifts. Again, if there is the ability to have 3 of them on site and a U, instead of having 19 of them on site, you got 3 that everybody uses. So it improves the efficiency of the project. In the 80s and 90s, when there was issues on a project or something wasn't quite fitting, the engineer would come to site, hand sketch it on your drawing, say, let's just do that. Maybe he'd initial it or whatever. It was never a big deal. Now the process is quite onerous to see changes in the project, and it's got to do with the contractual, the legal, and the financial things that have happened over the years. And I sat in a panel that ACA had put on, trying to find out why construction projects were typically over budget. The change orders are excessive. The drawing packages are huge. It takes a long time to get through the design stage. So they were looking at every aspect of it to find that out. And I think the bottom line is it comes down to a little bit of the legal world has driven that.
And I've spoken to contractors in several different trades, and the traditional way sometimes, I mean, I think we'd be lying if we didn't say they see that there's a gap somewhere in the scope, and they take advantage of it because they're businessmen. And they say, this isn't really clearly defined, so I can take advantage of that, probably get a change order and make something off of it. But moving to, say, an IPD delivery, then it is a shared experience so that everybody's sharing in the profits, so you're all working together. Have you seen that decrease the amount of changes and increase the amount of cooperation?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that type of construction process. And I think, again, it puts everybody in the same driver's seat and the same situation. There's not an advantage to one trade trying to deflect something from the other because the project takes a hit either way. And the owner sees it firsthand too. So it's not, well, you told me it was going to be this much money and that's it. Everybody's trying to come under budget because it increases profitability and everybody's trying to work cohesively. The key is, though, having the right team members with the right mindset to do that. But it has the potential to alleviate a lot of the traditional silo type things that we discussed on trade scope. So
yeah, it's more of a project first mentality.
it is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of trust from all parties, however, to be able to be successful in that. So
That is increasing in popularity. What do you see as some of the challenges besides maybe the buy-in? Because some people still are guarded against the buy-in and going into it and having all that shared, basically having open book, financial books so that everybody can see it. There is people guarded against that. Are there any other challenges?
well, I think the challenges come into play in terms of the initial budgeting and traditional ways that an owner would go to the financial institute to get the money in the first place. Say you're building a $25 million project, but understanding that it could be $27 million, a financial institute wants to know that you have a fixed contract for $25 million. So I think the owner has some challenges on the back end that not everybody sees as well. Everybody has a workforce, and there's good workers and average workers, and sometimes getting the right team together may take a project or two. So you may find that one of the players just isn't as forthcoming as they should have been or as responsive. So I think sometimes it takes a few projects to get it right with the right team. And I think that is, again, it's a difficult one for an owner to want to accept. They do typically think the average individual looks at building a building much the same as buying a car. And go to 3 different dealerships and think they're getting the exact same product. But again, back down to scope and definition, 3 proposals from 3 different builders isn't necessarily the same 3 buildings unless it was designed.
Like you say, you have your A, your B, and your C teams, I think,
Yeah.
think on everything. And project management is a big thing. So would an IPD project, from your point of view, require more administration from a project management? Like you almost need to have someone there all the time? Or is it equivalent to, say, the traditional design bid build?
The on-site project management side of things, scheduling and defining work flows and stuff, is very much the same. I would say the administration side goes down significantly because the significance of having pre-approved change orders and things can happen more in real time, and the tracking of some of that change orders and documentations and isn't as intensive that way. Still very important roles, but I would say overall the other side of things too is, like I said, the extent of details and documentation specifications that are required are down significantly as well. So ensuring that those things all are happening gets reduced as well. So I think it has the efficiency. It would take away some of that onus of the project management, and it puts some of it onto the trades to collaborate amongst themselves.
That's an interesting point, because that's one that can't really be financially driven, right?
Right.
Like you can't tell a bank that you're going to get a better product in the end. That kind of builds into another thing that was on my list when we're talking about things is we are going into what I would consider a new era of building codes, because now we have the National Energy Code for Buildings is now mandated. And with Alberta going with the Tier 1, and we will eventually have to work our way up, do you think that that more collaborative IPD process is better for the building in terms of efficiencies? And will that enable us to build better buildings?
With respect to the code side of things, how they work together, I think when you put those 2 items together, I think, again, the collaboration between trades is very important. So there's many ways to get there, I guess, at the end of the day for compliance. So obviously there's a prescriptive component to those, and then there's trade-off designs and whatnot. Again, coming from the mechanical side, it doesn't always fall to the building envelope itself. So sometimes the building envelope, if they choose a more creative design that doesn't necessarily lend itself to some of the energy code things, we can make up some of those differences on the mechanical systems by being over and above the efficiencies where possible. So I think, again, talking about those things openly early on in the design phase, and with the not just a design team, but the actual installers, makes a difference as well. So it becomes even more important to have that kind of team effect early on in the stages of it, so that, again, even when it comes down to being able to react to market industries, after situations with COVID and some of the supply chain interruptions that we had, the intent might have been to use a triple pane window with low E and to actually get it manufactured and get it here. That's how the building was designed, that's how it was engineered. But all of a sudden you have a supply chain interruption in the middle of a project. The ability of the team to work together to overcome that is where I think that type of project delivery really shines as well. And it's something until you've experienced it, you don't really see, right?
Yeah, we found that even in the roofing industry with supply chain issues, certain types of insulation, whether it would be COVID or the ship to block the Suez Canal, that affected our industry because we couldn't get certain insulations. And even when the freeze came to that plant in Texas, that affected one chemical, which just had a domino effect. People don't think that would affect the insulation on the roof, which would affect the mechanical system, which affects everything all in there. So it is interesting when you're in the industry to see how interconnected everything is. But then again, sometimes I know Bill Black is on record sometimes for saying the construction industry is kind of broken and we have to try to work and fix it. And I think we're getting there.
I've seen many different project delivery methods, and I've seen good projects that turned out successful. And I think the biggest ones, you brought up project management. And I think just like a band, a good project manager is like a conductor for an orchestra. Keeps everybody in timing. And if this section goes too slow and the flutes start too quick, it doesn't work either. And I think that's the same thing with a construction project. If the total commitment for build was 1 year, but you took 6 months getting the foundation out, and then what would have been roofing happening in prime weather time now is happening in the dead of winter, it impacts everybody. And those are the aspects I think that are broken in the industry. I don't think there's been enough commitment to things like scheduling and things like communication back to the owner, realistic expectations of things, and weather impacts so many trades. And temporary heating, based on what the intended schedule for a project was, shouldn't even been required, for example. And when we talk about a gap in trade definitions, temporary heating is typically one that's not a mechanical responsibility, but they look and say, well, there's all this equipment around, maybe we could make that work.
Fire that up?
Can't we fire that up because it's not in our trade scope, and then it becomes a contentious item because it affects warranties and things. And theoretically, if the building had been done in the time that it should have been, we wouldn't have had to fire that equipment up. So there's so many things that happen, again, on their feet. So again, different project delivery methods somewhat solve that. In an IPD environment, everybody understands that we need to continue working and that equipment may need to be fired up, and then the owner's in the middle of that meeting understanding the implications of warranty from the manufacturer if it's get used for temporary heating, or the costs associated with starting it up too early. So
yeah, he sees the overall picture, not just that one single, my warranty might be a little lessened on the side after occupancy, but it enabled me to finish the building 3 months quicker because of circumstances that are out of his control.
And vice versa. He may say, well, for the cost and the risk of doing that, I'm just going to extend the schedule for 3 months, and we don't do that scope while we're doing that. So again, it changes a lot of things, and that's where things like COVID, we learned a lot of things from that in terms of the ability to work with reduced workforces as we came out of COVID, and getting people back into a comfortable environment and productivity and all those things that the construction industry is saying is broken, and it's broken in a lot more industries than the construction when they talk about productivity and stuff. But it comes down to realistic expectations and the ability to communicate that to all the parties, because we see even in tendered projects a rudimentary schedule put together, but if a contractor bids that project and fixed prices it for a certain window that was told to them, the consequences of them not meeting that window don't seem to be heard all the time. So again, like any contractor, you usually don't have one project on the go. You had a free gap and your workforce was available during those 3 months, but that doesn't happen then, and then 2 projects come together in the same 3 months. That's when problems happen. And it's not fair to either party, really, but it does happen.
So one thing that you've really focused on, and I can appreciate, is that project management and the communication that is required from really all parties, the owner, the general contractor, the sub-trades, and everybody that's involved in that. How do you see that now versus 10 years from now? Like, we do have a workforce right now that is, the trades workforce is aging, and a lot of that experience is leaving, and the newer generation that comes into it might not have that experience. Are you seeing that that's starting to impact the timelines and the discussions on trade scope? It's just the experience of the new people coming in, and they haven't been through it, so they don't understand it, so it just kind of perpetually goes back to a starting block?
Well, I think experience is definitely a key one, and the aging workforce that we had that worked when trade definitions were traditionally mandated, or they as the workers understood the trade scopes as well. So they wouldn't necessarily, things like backfill and compaction, underground plumbing, they knew that they didn't do that. But now it's confusing because sometimes we have to include it and sometimes we don't, depending on the project. It's a mismatch of everything that's out there. So it's hard for them even to understand what is normal anymore. So that's one thing. And obviously there's definitely a gap in the skill sets between new workers and the older workers, but there's also 2 aspects to it as well, in terms of the older workers aren't necessarily receptive to new technologies, and we're always getting new technologies. So some of the new technologies make the job quicker and better and faster, and they're properly embraced. We can help schedule from that. And I don't know that matters whether or not it comes down to the training, and that's a company-based thing as well as a bit on the industry. So I've seen improvements and some setbacks on that type of thing. I think back to trade definition, one of the biggest things, and we spoke about project management briefly, and interestingly, project management is a role in itself. So a lot of the prime contractors are project management companies now, as opposed to what we used to define them as a general contractor. So a general contractor used to be, obviously, was the prime contractor, but they also had work within the project outside of just standard project management. I've seen a definite shift in industry to project management only. So when there are gaps in those trade definitions, there's nobody to pick them up.
They don't have those.
They don't have a miscellaneous trade that says, okay, well, we'll pour this little concrete pad for you, or we'll take care of shoring up that wall or framing in the rough bucks inside a building or in the wall. There's nobody to do that. So an example, sometimes a airside equipment that's on the roof sitting on a manufacturer's curb. Again, we don't always know exactly where on the roof it's sitting, or how thick that insulation is at that point, because the slopes sometimes change, and we might have been specified to provide a 14-inch roof curb. So we go and we put a 14-inch roof curb where there's a 10-inch insulation slope, and we're only sticking 4 inches above the roof. So again, we're not meeting the minimum requirements for an opening above roof from that side. Not everybody understands your guys' world, what those codes are, until you've got stung with something or something that way. But sometimes that has to be built up on wood sleepers or extended. And the mechanical saying, well, that's not part of our scope. We supplied the curb that was specified. The roofer saying, well, it's not our job to build those up. So there's nobody that has a 2x4 to build that thing up. when it came to sloped roofs, manufacturers traditionally in the past hadn't built slope curbs, or if they did, they were very defined slopes and the typical ones, but then if we had an odd slope, who was going to build that slope roof curb? Again, those are gaps and things that always tend to happen in these trade scopes because there's unique situations, and there's nobody on a current construction project of a traditional bid spec usually to pick that up and to say, fine, in the interest of the project, I'm going to do it.
Similar to that, we always, and we get several calls all the times when our inspectors do the final inspection. Well, there's an open roof curb and there's a mechanical piece coming through. We don't know if it's plumbing vent or if it's a B vent coming through or whatever. And they're like, it's an open curb. And the roofer's like, I roofed up to it. It's not mine. I don't know what the mechanical guy's putting in. The mechanical's like, well, we're 6 weeks away from our equipment going in there.
Yeah.
So really you have an open hole going into the building and nobody is set for doing it. But, then it comes to a lot of times just the communication, a lot of times the goodwill of the relationship between the contractor and the owner saying, you know what, you need a 2 foot by 2 foot piece of plywood screwed in there. I'll just go and do it.
Yeah.
And like you say, that's kind of what's missing right now is.
And there's always been some big ticket items too that fall through the cracks and happens at the consulting level, a function of the trade definition. So how the trade definitions might even impact the consultant roles in that things like catwalks and access ladders and things to roofs. It'll say in the trade definitions that if it's detailed on the mechanical, that the mechanical's supposed to deal with them. And if it's not detailed on the mechanical, then it's supposed to be detailed on architectural, structural, and then the structural steel people will be responsible for them. But when it's not detailed on either, but they're needed.
Called up in the spec, they're not drawn on the drawing.
Yeah, and because the structural engineer thought that the mechanical would have it included and he missed it, and then the owner's upset because it's usually a pretty big ticket item. And nobody has it and nobody realizes they don't have it until it's nearing the end of the project, and then it impacts the roofers because all of a sudden if we needed an access ladder and catwalks on the roof and they needed to be supported down and half the roofing's done and there wasn't any standoffs put in place and things. So everybody gets impacted when something like that happens. And so as good as the trade definitions have been, there's still some of those types of things that always traditionally fall through the cracks.
And we're not building square boxes anymore.
No.
A lot of the things we're building are more complicated shapes, more unique designs. Now we're getting into more unique building envelopes and cladding and all that. So it's definitely not a one size fits all.
No, it's not. I made reference to new technologies on our mechanical roll. Well, you guys have just as many on the roofing side, and I've seen on projects now, traditionally we used to be responsible for flashing, and we would hand the roof drain to the roofer and say, once you got this in, I'll come along and hook it up, because you guys are responsible for dealing with the storm collar and fastening that there. Debate on that and how that happened over the year, but next thing you know, now we're seeing manufacturers with specialty roof drains and specialty plumbing vent, which is hats and different things that you used to have, and we don't always, and sometimes that's not even the product that was specified. So we've ordered all the roof drains for the project, but then again, back to a cost savings or a change, the whole roofing system got changed, and now we've got 75 roof drains sitting in our trailer on site that are no good for this project. And it happens, those types of things. So if we were told that we have to supply the roof drains, we've allowed something for roof drains, but then when it changes, now that falls to the roofing guy to supply those. There's a cost to those as well.
Oh, just a minute, Tim. Let's pause right here and take a small break. Thank you for listening to another episode of ARCA's Elevated Views. We hope you have enjoyed the program. For additional information on ARCA, our contractors, or our program, please go to arcaonline.ca. Or you could follow us on Instagram at Roofing Careers or on LinkedIn at ARCA-Alberta Roofing Contractors Association.